Making game assets is difficult, especially 3D games. And one of the hardest parts of making games comes with making your own custom assets, which is a vital skill to have for making your own indie games. Today in this video I'll show you how I make my video game assets in Blender, which is a free open source 3D software, and I'll be importing it into my game engine of choice, which is Godot. So first off, open Blender, and as tradition goes, delete that default cube. Then usually you'll get stuck at the stage of endless dread of figuring out where to start. So you give up and you go play your favorite game. Wait, hold on, no, let's take a step back and do this the correct way. Every project, no matter how small or big, should start with a plan. So we'll start with planning. Open up a to-do list tab of choice. I like to use Notion for planning things out. Our initial step is gathering references. Then we start our modeling, texturing, baking textures, and finally export our assets to our game engine. We will go through all of these steps, and I'll give you a general idea on how to do all of it. First of all, you need to decide on a theme. For indie devs, low poly and stylized, which is my favorite, are the choices that make the most sense. For collecting references, I use Pinterest. It has a very good algorithm that shows you similar images to the ones you search for, and it's as simple as just dragging it and dropping it into PureRef. This is not an in-depth modeling tutorial for Blender. There are plenty of amazing resources out there. I recommend none other than the donut from Blender Guru as a starting point. So instead, the aim here is to bridge any gaps you guys might have when trying to make a 3D game, but I will walk you through the process of what we're making today. So now we start in Blender, this time with a plan. First, delete the default cube, of course, then add a cube. It's always helpful to include a human reference, as you need correct looking scale when importing to our game. I start with making a basic shape resembling my final outcome and start carving away at it, adding more detail until I feel it looking good. It's really helpful to turn on cavity settings from the overlays to help you see details. So it's really basic modeling tools that I'm using here, just using bevels, loop cuts, solidify, modifiers, mirror modifier of course. I really like the shortcut workflow for Blender. I feel like it saves me a lot of time instead of just working with the gizmo like we do in other softwares. As you can see, we just take incremental steps to improve our level of detail. It's really not that hard, but it's time consuming sometimes, depending on the models of course. Every time you feel like you're stuck in the modeling phase, you just go back and look at some references, take a step back, take a break, look at those references. Having a second screen helps with looking at your references, but it's definitely not necessary, so no excuses. Modeling in Blender is one of my favorite parts. I find it very therapeutic and relaxing. What's really cool about this workflow is that it can work with low to medium end machines. So again, no excuses, so don't try. Unless you want your models to only have a solid color, which is honestly fine for prototyping, you should pay attention to the next couple of steps. I start with setting up a basic light setup to help me visualize my model and materials. There are two ways to make a simple stylized material. The first is the easiest and can work great for prototyping your games. The first method is simply applying solid colors and maybe changing the metalness and roughness values for our materials. So you just select all of your assets, link up all the materials. Our second material, of course, it's always helpful to name your materials. I'm making it a wood color here. Of course, linking that material, including that part that I missed. And that's it. You're done. You can just export the models as is to Godot or any other game engine in fact. But wait, don't click off this video yet, as with a little more work, you can make these materials way better with our second method. So the second method is also very simple, just slap on a gradient. Gradient makes everything look better. Just look at those trees. Of course, change it to object mapping. And then I rotate the gradient so it starts from the bottom to the top. I tweak the values until I feel satisfied with the result. This feels good. And then I add a color ramp. This simple gradient really helps with making my models look more dimensional. They have more depth to them. And I apply this method also to my metallic materials. One more addition we can make, which can be a good improvement and is done a lot in the gaming industry, is adding ambient occlusion to our diffuse color. So you basically just add an ambient occlusion node and then you can preview it either in Eevee, but Cycles gives a better preview. We are also going to be baking it in Cycles, so it's better to preview it that way. Then you add a color ramp after the ambient occlusion node and tweak it until you're satisfied with the result. After you get a result you're happy with, you can just mix it with your base color. Adding ambient occlusion really helps with real-time renderers, as you don't have to render these shadows that are the effect of close proximity objects, which is usually hard to calculate for real-time renderers, and even when they do it, it's not as accurate as just baking it. Of course, you also have to do the same steps for our metallic materials or any other materials for our asset. Now when finishing this step, you will need to do some material baking. In Blender, making and editing materials is very flexible, but it comes at a cost of performance, which contradicts how game engines are designed. So it's not even possible to translate that flexibility that is specific to Blender to our game engines. So we have to bake our textures, which is very similar if you can imagine it like we're just applying our modifiers. It's like applying our textures, but it takes a little more time. Now for my workflow, I use Simple Bake, which is a great add-on for Blender. It takes all the pain of the default way to bake textures in Blender, which is also definitely possible, and there's plenty of amazing tutorials out there on baking materials. And for simple objects like this, it's not hard at all. But as soon as objects get a little more complex, it takes a lot more time. So basically you add the desired object into the bake objects of the Simple Bake menu, and then in the PPR bakes, select your desired textures to be baked. For my purposes, I'll use the diffuse, metalness and the roughness textures. Of course, you can use the alpha and the normal depending on your purposes. If it's a cutout material, you can use the alpha. This is my UV settings. Sometimes I make my own UV maps, but this add-on helps with making new UV maps that work out of the box, but they are not always very optimized. So it's still recommended to make your own UV maps. You can take a look at all of the settings in these menus, but it's really easy to use, and there's also a lot of tutorials that are dedicated to Simple Bake. Once you're done with all the settings, just click on that bake button, which does everything for you. You can see how fast it is for simple models like this, so even if you have a slower machine, it's not a very big problem. You can even use the CPU and GPU to bake whatever suits you and your machine best. So once the bake is over, you will have a new object in your scene, only with the baked textures. You can see how optimized this workflow is, transferring all of your node setup, no matter how complex it is, to just 3 simple textures that are specific to our model. And this is the best layout for our game engines, just to have these simple textures without any complexities, without any node setups. And now we're ready to export our object to our game engine. So you go to File and Export. You can choose the GLTF format, which is the recommended way to export to the Godot engine. Just make sure you have selected objects checked. We don't have any animations on this object, so you can check it off. You can mess with these settings for compression or materials. For this process, I'm gonna leave it all default. Just make sure you check the apply modifiers in case you have any modifiers on your object. And now you can go ahead and export. So now you can just open up Godot. This is a very simple FPS template that I use to test out my models. As you can see, it's a very basic movement template. So now you can create a new folder, name it models, put it inside of your assets folder. Importing assets into Godot is as easy as dragging it and dropping it. Almost ready. Now you can see some weird compression going on in Godot. You can go ahead and choose your texture and go to the import settings in Godot and change the compression settings to the ones you find work best for you. I chose VRAM uncompressed and the texture looks fine now. And that's it, you're done and ready. Now in a future video, I'll probably talk about how to make it animatable, opening and closing this chest. If you thought this video was helpful, go ahead and hit that like and maybe subscribe for future videos. This is my first video on this channel. I hope you guys liked it. Thank you so much for watching and have a great day.